So what I want to do is just give sort of a high-level introduction to deep learning and its application to neuroimaging. Let me just start with kind of a brief introduction. We've all heard about big data. And so big data in the context of brain imaging is, well, we want to use, obviously, brain data to inform us about brain disorders, for example. And so big data means, well, we'll collect more data. High temporal resolution, high spatial resolution, lots of subjects, et cetera. But then we end up being buried by data. The brain is very complex. The data is noisy. The data is complex as well. So what we really need are methods that can hopefully automatically extract some useful results, some meaning from that data. How many people see something besides rocks in this picture? Anybody? No? How about if I do that? So there's actually a person in there painted to look like rocks. The goal of these kinds of techniques is to find patterns in the data, and hopefully they're real patterns like this one. Not just fitting random rocks around the data, but something that we hope is meaningful and useful. So let me start with some of the basic building blocks of deep learning, one of which is an artificial neural network. And essentially what you have is some input data, and then what you're doing is you're kind of estimating weights that are summed up and then are passed through some function, typically a nonlinear function. It can either be a step function, meaning it's an on or an off, or it can be a continuous nonlinear function. And then if you stack these together, you build up something called a multi-layer perceptron. And so in this case, we have a single sort of hidden layer. We have an input. We have an output. And then here we have two hidden layers. And you can kind of continue to stack these. So deep learning, as many of you may already know, has had a lot of successes over the past few years, which has really propelled it into the mainstream. It's mastered Go, so it can beat human masters at a very complex game. It can play video games. You can use it to imitate style, and also fill in gaps in images, et cetera. A lot of really neat tools have been coming out there. There have a number of sort of a history of deep learning. It's really gone through a series of sort of hype, overhype, failure, hype, overhype, failure, at least 2 or 3 times. And you can see some of those here. But more recently, it really has shown that in the context of, for example, imaging, in particular, AlexNet is one of them, which is something called a convolutional neural network. It showed that it could really outperform many of the state-of-the-art techniques in terms of sort of prediction of labeled images. And that was also sort of an instigator in terms of GPU processing. GPU units are much more efficient at estimating deep learning models. And you can see here, once AlexNet in around 2012 had its success, GPU use started to ramp up, and it goes. This is obviously dated here, but it's really huge now, and lots of GPU units are being processed and used. In terms of the evolution, it started fairly modestly with 5 layers. Linnet, AlexNet was a 7-layer model. And then 22, and then 56 layers. Now there are hundreds and thousands of layers being used. In the context of brain imaging, we're not there yet because of the amount of data you would need to train that model. You need millions and millions of samples. But the examples I'll show you today are sort of typically, tens of layers, and sometimes less than that. The other thing that, in addition to just labeled imaging, it's transferred to other fields. Here I'm having trouble reading my slides. I can't see on either one here very well, but we have retina images here, dermatology, et cetera. And brain imaging, if you look at PubMed, you'll see that there's at this point, over 100 papers using deep learning on MRI data, and that's growing rapidly. One of the ways that you can use the different layers is in the concept of, and here we have just like a 3-layer type model where you have at the highest level concepts, so things like faces or cars. Intermediate layers are sort of elemental pieces of that, or features, right? So eyes, mouths, etc. And then at the lowest layer here, we have sort of features like edge detectors, etc. It's not always this intuitive. It doesn't always work this way, but in some of these simple cases, this is what we get. And you may have seen like Google has this neural network that sort of they've called like a dream network, and you can kind of take images and pass those in there, and it starts to show these really weird Cheshire cat type and intriguing artwork from the middle layers. All that being said, there are a ton of ways to do deep learning. It's a rapidly growing field. Here I'm just showing you a high-level view of some of the many models, and there's many more than this. And every few months, there's many more models that come out. And so it's really kind of exhausting to stay up with the field. I would say pick a simple model and start with that first, and just see how that works to get introduced to it. Some of the key advances that contributed to the deep learning growth are lots of data, so Twitter and Google searches, etc. Some of the standard benchmark data. For example, there's series of images, series of numbers, etc. Computation, I mentioned GPUs already. Different strategies for training the data, for optimizing, and for basically learning these different layers sequentially, one by one. So now let me give you I'm just going to cover some of these models, some of these more basic models, and give you an example of some work applied to neuroimaging for each of them. So a basic model is called a restricted Boltzmann machine. That's typically not a deep network. That's a shallow model. It's restricted because within a layer, we don't have connections between the layers, only between these two layers. And what you're doing is you're trying to optimize, you're trying to estimate these weights, and you're optimizing a function called Gibbs energy. In the context of a restricted Boltzmann machine, we looked at this with some fMRI data, and we found that it was able to perform and extract resting networks that were very similar to those you would get from an ICA analysis. And you can see some of the simulated comparisons down here. So in that case, it's one of the things that I think is important is that we get not just accuracies or classifications, but we learn something about the brain. We can look at the imaging aspects of the brain, the networks, etc. And so that interpretability, I think, is important to emphasize. A deep belief network is essentially a stacked set of restricted Boltzmann machines. So you kind of feed the output of one into the next, and you can kind of build as many of those as you would like. So the way you do that is you start with your raw data, you feed it into a restricted Boltzmann machine, and you learn the weights. Perhaps your goal is to classify two groups, right? And then once you've trained that, you feed the output of that into the next layer and learn those weights again with the goal of doing a classifier, and you propagate that through all the layers one by one. Okay? We applied basically a 3-layer deep belief network to brain imaging data. This was gray matter segmentation maps. So like the basically a voxel-wise map. Each voxel ranged between 0 and 1% of gray matter. We were trying to predict schizophrenia versus healthy controls. And what I'm showing you here from left to right is, if you're looking at the raw data versus visualizing it versus 1 layer, 2 layers, or 3 layers. And when the algorithm finally converged, what we ended up finding was that we get the most separation between both testing and training groups at the 3-layer, for the 3-layer model. And it actually increased as we went from 1 to 2 to 3, suggesting that we're gaining some ability to classify these groups by extracting that sort of nonlinear information. Using the same kind of model in a larger data set of Huntington's disease, we showed that we could very accurately predict healthy controls from Huntington's disease. But then after the fact, since we know the severity of Huntington's is determined by the number of CAG repeats, we can color code this by a measure of disease severity, low, medium, and high, and you see that the least severe patients were closest to the controls, and there was this gradient, and the most severe was furthest away. So this was interesting to us because the model actually knew nothing about disease severity. It just learned that from the data. When we color-coded it post hoc, we saw that it had learned this information. That's not always going to happen, but the idea is that hopefully this is extracting useful information from the data that we can utilize. And we've done this also for sort of a complex class of psychiatric disorders. So in this case, we have schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, schizoaffective, healthy controls, and unaffected relatives. Again, looking at layer 1 layer, 2 layers, and 3 layers. And you see the 3 layer gives us the best separation from these groups. And I think here, I wasn't actually expecting it to perfectly separate the groups, given the diagnostic categories are so flawed. But what we can do then is we can start to look at these individuals that are sort of on the boundary cases or overlapping between these different groups. This is just another example looking at predicting mild cognitive impairment that would transition to Alzheimer's disease. So here in colored dots, we have essentially controls, stable mild cognitive impairment, progressive, meaning that they'll convert, and then Alzheimer's disease. And you can see that it actually found this nice gradient between the two. This, again, was using gray matter segmentation maps as input, so structural MRI data. Another type of layer, I've already mentioned multi-layer perceptrons. We can actually implement something, a type of ICA that moves beyond linear relationships, essentially nonlinear ICA, using a set of multi-layer perceptrons, as I'm showing here. And so in this case, we simulated some nonlinear components. So the mixing, was not linearly a linear function. It was a nonlinear function. And we show that the ground truth was best estimated in that case by the nonlinear ICA models. And it was also able to capture linear models, linear relationships as well. When we applied this to brain imaging data, we found that basically we get these sort of covariating gray matter patterns. This is called structure-based morphometry. But when we removed essentially the linear effect and looked at the residual, we found that some of them were showing primarily just a linear effect. Others were showing this sort of nonlinear relationship in the data. So it does appear that we have nonlinearities in our data we've been ignoring, and these kinds of models can help us to identify those. One of the things that often comes up with deep models is we need a lot more data, and we don't have really that much data on brain imaging, even with 10,000 or 100,000 people. That's small compared to tens of millions of data sets. And so you can try to mitigate that by basically generating realistic simulated data. One of the ways we've done this is we basically decomposed some data with ICA, and then we used basically added a random noise and created mixed data sets from that. This is called data augmentation, and you can sort of take a subset of data, generate a bunch of random simulated data that is permutations around that data to train your model, to get it up to a point where it's sort of mostly trained. And then you use the rest of your data, which is the valuable data, to estimate the remainder of the model parameters. And that works pretty well. It gives you a substantial improvement in performance for example, when you're doing a classification problem. Another type of model is called an autoencoder. What you're doing with an autoencoder, it's typically this sort of triangle where it goes down and then back out. It's essentially got two parts, an inference part where you're basically taking input data and then you're trying to find a low-dimensional code that represents that data. That might be just 2 points, patient or control, for example, or it might be multiple categories. And then you have this generative net, which basically goes beyond that and tries to take these codes and predict or generate new samples from the data. And so this is used to, for example, generate realistically looking handwritten numbers. You can see how it starts fuzzy, and then as you keep iterating, you get pretty good results. And there are lots of variations on this. Variational autoencoder, for example, essentially adds, instead of just using a single code, it's actually got a probabilistic representation using a mean and a standard deviation vector. And I've got the obligatory cat picture in my talk, so check that box off. This is some work by Jay Kim and his group where they basically used essentially a stacked autoencoder. And what they were using as input data was functional connectivity matrices from fMRI. And so here you can kind of see, I know this is fairly complex, but essentially they've got these stacked autoencoders, and they're trying to predict schizophrenia from healthy controls. One of the nice things about this model is that you can then go back and look at the different layers, and you can see the different connectivity values where red is greater in controls, blue is greater in patients. And in addition, the deep network that they used had substantially lower error than some other competitive support vector machine models. Now, a convolutional neural network is another approach where you basically have your, say an image, and you break it into small patches, and then you slide those patches really around the window. It's basically called convolution. And you can do that sort of in multiple stages, breaking it down into smaller and smaller patches. And you can construct essentially a convolutional autoencoder as well, where you basically have, again, this sort of high dimensional to low and then low back to high. This kind of a model works really well for imaging data, if you want to preserve the imaging features and not just ignore them and treat them as a vector. It's been used a lot for segmentation. Here's an example from brain segmentation, where we basically took a free surfer labeled atlas as our training data, and then we trained the model to predict the free surfer labels from that data. And this is done in native space, so you don't have to do any pre-processing to your images. And it essentially gives you these high-quality segmentations that you can then apply to new data. So once the data is, once the model is estimated, you can basically get a free surfer quality segmentation in less than 2 minutes. Here's an example where we're showing you can extend this also to multimodal data, so T1 and T2. And you can see some examples of those segmentations. If you want to try it out and see if it works, you've got some data, you can upload it to this website. It's called brainshop.org. See how well the segmentation works on your data. This model here is trained on 3T data, just as a caveat. We have trained a subsequent model on 1.5 Tesla data as well. As I mentioned, nonlinear ICA, you can do the same kind of thing in the context of fMRI data. In this case, we're using a temporal convolutional neural network feature extractor. This is work by Aapo Hyverinen's group and Hiroshi Muraida. And here you can basically see networks that you get out from a linear ICA compared to those you get out from a nonlinear ICA model. One of the ways that they were trying to validate this was to look at the stability, and they found that the nonlinear model was actually more stable across individuals than was the linear model. Okay. Now, a recurrent neural network is essentially a network that contains a memory, right? So it's got t and then h of t minus 1. So it's got this sort of feedback loop associated with it. And so this kind of model is most useful for when you have a series, like time series data, so like fMRI data, for example. And so here is a type of recurrent network. It's called, in this case, a gated recurrent network, which is essentially a variation on a recurrent neural network that's a little bit more adaptive, and it works better on smaller data sets. And so we took resting state fMRI data and used it, in this case, to predict healthy control or schizophrenia patients from that resting fMRI data. And here you can see the result where we have controls and we have patients plotted here in different colors. We have some of the key components that were predictive in this model. And I should mention, we actually fed in this case, not the raw data, but time courses from an ICA analysis. It was kind of a two-step analysis. And another example of this where we've tried to predict the dynamic connectivity in the data. So in this case, we're not just focused on changes over time in the correlation. We're looking at true spatial temporal dynamics. And so this is a recurrent neural network model. Essentially, we get a time series of spatial patterns for each of our networks. So we have sort of temporal evolution of those patterns. And then we can use this model to predict time points in the data. So we can predict, for example, one example we applied this to was an event-related analysis where we have an auditory oddball stimulus, and so we can predict the next stimulus in the series. Or you could predict, in the case of data where we have recorded labeled sleep condition with concurrent EEG data, we can predict what sleep state they're going to be in the future. Okay, and then hybrid models would be those that are really trying to do multimodal, combine multimodal information together. In this case, we have two different types of models: an attentional model, where we've got a figure and a caption, and given once the model's trained, given a word in the caption, it sort of highlights where that word is most relevant in the figure, right? So in this case, frisbee, here girl, right, highlights the face of the girl. And then we have a learning alignment model, which is used for translating, for example, English to French, where you might have one word translates to 3 words, or you might have the order of the words being different. And so those kinds of complexities need to be handled by the model. We've applied this in the context of brain imaging data, where we have structural features extracted with source-based morphometry, sort of a spatial ICA to get covariant patterns of gray matter. And on the fMRI data side, we've used a time-varying connectivity model. So we basically have states here, a state vector associated with each subject, where we can indicate at which point in time are they in which connectivity state. Okay? And so combining that two bits of information together, you can think of the gray matter maps as kind of the figure, and the connectivity dynamic state vectors as sort of the caption of the data. And so we essentially have structural features and functional features both being estimated by these models. One is an attentional, one is a sequence predictor model. And the results were pretty interesting, we thought. And so here, for example, we have a structural feature here that's tightly linked to a functional feature for state 1. And both of these distributions represent schizophrenia and healthy controls, and they're both significantly aligned. They're not anywhere near 0. So there's a link between the structure and the function in this data. But in addition, beyond that, we see in this case, the healthy controls are more strongly linked between structure and function for this state than are the schizophrenia patients. So there's a significant difference there as well. And this is in a temporal lobe region. Okay. And then the last example is just trying to basically look at imaging genomics. So we have here gray matter segmentation images, and then we have single nucleotide polymorphism data, so basically genetic data. And we've basically got a model like this that has a sort of unimodal leg to it. So we have SNP data and structural MRI data, and then we have a fusion layer that combines the two together. In this case, we were looking really at classification. And so here you get a decent separation with structural MRI. Typically, the genetic data is very, very, very small in terms of the effects, and you don't get a very good separation here. But when we combine them together, you start to see a pretty good separation between the two. My slide you just have to trust me on that, because that slide's kind of messed up there. So I don't know what happened with those. They're nicely separated. Let me just say it that way. And in addition, once we fit this model, we can actually estimate using something called relevance propagation. Going back to the layers of the model, we can estimate which genes were most relevant and which regions were most relevant. Okay? There are a lot of tools out there for doing deep learning. Some of the more popular ones are TensorFlow, which is a Google open, sort of freely available package, Torch, Theano, etc. And there's a lot more than what I've listed on this slide. A lot of them are Python-based tools. We've got a few tools. The one we've got is called Cortex, which is a Python-based tool being developed by Devin Helm. With that, I want to thank my lab. Thank you guys for your attention. And I guess, do we have time for the quiz? Okay. I think the quiz is pretty easy, but we'll see.